Lena had always been a lover of old things, ancient books, vintage furniture, and especially abandoned houses. There was something deeply compelling about them, an allure that felt both eerie and inviting. The peeling paint on the walls, the creaking floors, the layers of dust and cobwebs, they all told a story of a place once full of life, now left to decay. It was in one of these dilapidated, forgotten places that Lena found her next obsession. She had been searching for months when she stumbled across an old estate deep in the countryside. The listing was strange. No price, just a vague description of its location and a few blurry photos. It looked like a relic from another time, a mansion with towering spires, surrounded by overgrown ivy and a sprawling garden that was once likely filled with vibrant flowers. But now it was all but buried in neglect. It had a haunting charm, one that beckoned her in. After a brief visit, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling to her. There was a strange energy that pulsed beneath the surface, something hidden in its very walls. The real estate agent, a frail old man who seemed as though he had never left the property, spoke cryptically about the house's history. It had once been owned by a wealthy family, but after a tragic accident, it had been abandoned and left to crumble. The agent didn't say much more, but he didn't need to. Lena was already hooked. She purchased the estate within a week, eager to restore it to its former glory. Moving in was a challenge. The house was full of broken windows, cracked floors, and rooms that had been sealed shut for decades. But despite the disrepair, Lena couldn't help but be drawn to the place. It felt like a piece of history waiting to be uncovered. As she explored the mansion, she found rooms filled with old furniture covered in dusty sheets, portraits of people she didn't recognize, and shelves lined with forgotten heirlooms. But it wasn't just the physical decay that fascinated her. There was something else. Lena began to feel an almost magnetic pull toward one specific part of the house, the western wing. This section, particularly a small, seemingly insignificant door that she noticed upon her first day, intrigued her the most. The door was old, weathered, and bolted shut with iron bolts that had long since rusted. It didn't seem to fit with the rest of the house, as though it didn't belong. Lena tried to ignore it, focusing on other areas of the house, but every time she passed by the door, she felt a chill run down her spine. She couldn't help but wonder what lay behind it, what was so important that it had been locked away for so long. Over time, the door became an obsession. Every creak of the house seemed to beckon her closer. It was as if the house itself was waiting for her to uncover its secrets, and finally, she could no longer resist. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the floorboards, Lena decided it was time. Armed with a crowbar she had found in the basement, she approached the door. The house felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath, watching her. Lena hesitated for just a moment, but then she pried the crowbar into the rusted bolts, the metal groaning in protest as she pulled them free. The door creaked open, with a groan that reverberated through the house, and she stepped inside. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the flashlight she'd brought. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as though it had not been disturbed in years. Dust motes danced in the beam of light swirling around her. It was colder here than the rest of the house, and there was a musty, stale smell in the air, a mixture of damp wood and something else, something that Lena couldn't quite place. The room was small, its stone walls cracked and damp. There was no furniture, nothing to suggest that anyone had been in there for a long time. What stood out to her the most was the absolute silence. Unlike the rest of the house, which creaked and groaned as it settled, this room was deathly still. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to make the next move. Lena walked further into the room, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust. She shone the flashlight on the walls, noticing strange, faded markings. At first she thought they were just signs of age, but as she examined them more closely she realized they were something else. The markings seemed deliberate, almost like symbols or writing in a language she couldn't recognize. It sent a shiver down her spine, and she stepped back, unsure of what she was looking at. That's when she heard it. A faint whisper. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but there was something distinctly human about it. A voice, soft and distant, calling her name. Lena. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She turned around quickly, shining the flashlight into the dark corners of the room, but there was no one there. The whispers continued, soft but growing louder. They came from the walls themselves, as if the very stones were alive. Lena, help us. The words were faint but distinct. Her pulse quickened. Who or what was speaking to her? She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling, or perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her. But no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, grew stronger. As the whispers continued, Lena felt an overwhelming urge to leave, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Something about the room was drawing her in, holding her captive in a way she couldn't understand. And then, just as she thought the whispers might stop, they grew more frantic. The walls themselves seemed to vibrate with the sound, and Lena's heart pounded in her chest. The longer Lena stood in the room, the more disoriented she became. The whispers began to intertwine, voices overlapping each other, all of them calling to her, pleading with her. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Lena could see her breath in the beam of her flashlight. She tried to leave, but the whispers seemed to keep her rooted in place. Lena, help us. It's not too late. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder. Desperate, she stumbled backward toward the door, but something held her back. There was no longer any sound of the house, no creaks or groans, just the overwhelming cacophony of these voices, now insistent, demanding her attention. Lena, we are trapped. Trapped in here. Help. Lena's chest tightened with panic. The walls, the floor, everything seemed to pulse with life, and she could feel a growing pressure in the room. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were becoming something else, something tangible, something that felt like it was alive. She could hear the agony in their tones, the desperation that filled each word. Whoever or whatever was speaking to her was in pain, trapped in this cursed space, and they wanted her to help them. Terror gnawed at her insides, but her feet wouldn't move. It was as if something was preventing her from leaving, a force beyond her understanding. She couldn't tell if the whispers were real or if they were a product of her own fear, but they felt real, too real to ignore. A sudden gust of wind blew through the room, making the air even colder. The whispers intensified, becoming almost frantic now, each voice merging into one. They weren't just calling her name anymore, they were begging, pleading, screaming. The sound was deafening, filling her mind with a deafening pressure. It was too much for her to comprehend. She wanted to run, to escape, but her body felt frozen in place. Then through the chaos of voices, a single clear sentence broke through the noise. It is your turn now. Lena's eyes widened, and the air around her grew thick, oppressive. The voices stopped, and in their silence, a feeling of finality settled over the room. Something was watching her, something was waiting. The air grew still once more, and for a moment, Lena thought the whispers had ceased. But as she exhaled, hoping to clear the overwhelming tension that had settled on her chest, she felt a chill run down her spine. Her flashlight flickered, casting the room into darkness for a moment, and when it came back on, she saw it. A figure was standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. At first, Lena thought it was a trick of her mind, but then the figure moved slowly, unnaturally, its limbs bending in strange angles. It was a woman, pale with skin that looked like it had been drained of life. Her eyes were hollow, dark circles staring out at Lena with an unsettling, knowing gaze. Lena's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was contorted in an eerie, twisted smile, as if she found some dark satisfaction in the fear that was growing inside Lena. The woman began to move toward her, crawling along the floor with jerky, erratic motions. Her limbs cracked as she moved, the sickening sound of bones snapping echoing in the silent room. Lena's heart pounded in her chest as she tried to back away, but the room felt smaller with every passing second, as though the walls were closing in on her. As the figure neared, the whispers returned, louder now, more urgent. "Help us. Help us." Lena's legs refused to move, as if the very ground was holding her in place. The woman's mouth opened wider, her smile grotesque, revealing rows of jagged teeth. She reached out with a bony hand, her fingers long and cold, and Lena could feel the air grow even colder as the woman's hand brushed against her ankle. Panic surged through Lena. With a burst of adrenaline, she wrenched herself free and stumbled backward, knocking over a pile of old crates. The figure remained unmoving, but the room seemed to grow darker, and the whispers now filled her head entirely, drowning out all other thoughts. Lena's mind reeled, but she had no more time to process. The moment her back hit the door, the room seemed to collapse in on her. The floorboards beneath her feet groaned as if protesting her every movement. Something was dragging at her legs, pulling her toward the center of the room. The woman was still there, but she wasn't the only threat. The walls seemed to shift, pulsing as if they had a life of their own. "Help us." The whisper was louder, all-encompassing, like it was seeping into her bones, into her very soul. Her vision blurred and she struggled to scream, but no sound came from her mouth. It felt like the room was swallowing her whole, each second stretching out longer than the last. The air was thick with something ancient and malevolent, something that had waited in this room for so long, hungry for its next victim. And then, with one final heart-wrenching scream, Lena was gone. When the neighbors passed by the estate the next day, they saw nothing unusual. The house stood silently as if it had never been disturbed. But if you listened closely, you could hear it. Soft whispers on the wind, waiting for someone new to claim.